Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the HVI podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor AJ Levine. And today's discussion will be based on her book titled The Difficult Words of Jesus. I'll the link to purchase the book in the description below and in the pinned comment. It's also pinned in the live chat on the top. So if you want to go purchase it, you just click on that link and get yourself a copy. And that being said, AJ, thank you very much for joining me today.
Always fun to be with you.
Thank you for joining me once again. What would you say are some of the most difficult words of Jesus that you can list, like maybe the top 5? And my second part to that question would be, what trail did you follow that caused you I want to focus on it and discuss the difficult words of Jesus?
Well, I want to start with the second question because it gets me to the first. People write to me. My former students write to me. Present students write to me. Pastors, priests, people in Bible study write to me. And they very frequently ask the same question, like, why does Jesus say we have to hate our families? Or what's this whole thing about sell all you have and give to the poor? And why does Jesus talk about going to hell? And why does he restrict salvation just to people who worship him? And why does he say we have to be slaves? That's a horrible image. And a variety of other topics along those lines. And I thought, okay, normally what I would do is I would type out, because I try to be attentive to people who think I have something worthwhile to say. So I would type out some brief answers, and then they would write back and ask for qualification. And then I finally thought, well, I really ought to write a short book about this, so I don't have to keep writing out the answers every time somebody emails me. I can just say, hey, look, there's this paperback book out there from Abingdon. Go buy it. It's user-friendly. It doesn't have big footnotes. So the reason I wrote the book was actually for practical reasons. It saves me time in the long run. And the second reason is these are questions that I think about too. Because I think that we ought to take Jesus seriously when he says something that may cause us to recoil. Rather than just say, oh, the Bible says that I believe it, and that's it. I think we ought to wrestle with this stuff. I mean, the word Israel, according to traditional etymology, is probably a fake etymology, means something like to wrestle with God. So we ought to wrestle with some of that stuff that's hard to do. I'm Jewish. We wrestle with stuff in the scriptures of Israel and the Tanakh, commands to genocide that we have in the book of Deuteronomy, for example, or the idea that Abraham's supposed to sacrifice his kid. Why shouldn't we be wrestling with the stuff that Jesus says? And I find that when we wrestle with it, we actually come up with some very good ethical questions. And those ethical questions then can help us live more fulfilled lives, more righteous lives.
And so what would you say are like the top 5 most difficult sayings of Jesus, if you had to point them out?
I think I just listed them. Or at least these are the ones that people find to be the most difficult. There are others that are. A lot of people struggle with the infancy materials, like does God really become incarnated in human flesh, or the miracles, or the resurrection narratives. Still others worry about Jesus' comments, calling a Gentile woman a dog, right? Something else to wrestle with. They wrestle with his yelling. I think he's yelling. The text doesn't say, and he yelled at. But I think he yells at his disciples, particularly in the Gospel of Mark, like, are you also without understanding, you nutnicks? What's your problem? They wrestle with the idea that God would put a divine child to death, that God would put anybody to death. So there's a lot of stuff to wrestle with. But the major concerns are the ones that hit home. Are we supposed to be afraid of hell? And does Jesus really consign people to hell? Are we supposed to hate? I mean, really hate our spouses, our parents, our children, our own lives? What exactly does that mean? And if we hate ourselves, how can we love anybody else? Here I'm paraphrasing RuPaul, but some of your listeners will understand that. What does it mean to sell all you have and give to the poor? And granted, it's a one-off. I mean, he only says that to one particular person. But the disciples actually say to him, look, we've left everything and followed you. And they did. I mean, they left their homes and their families. They left the Galilee to follow him to Judea. So what's going on here with these demands? And how does somebody who thinks that following Jesus is a good idea, whether for religious reasons or just for ethical reasons, how does somebody deal with that stuff?
Does the waters even get more muddier when one compares Matthew and Luke's sayings, because they both have the same sayings, but different formulations of them, does it only make things even more complicated?
In these cases, Matthew will sort of massage some of the more difficult material. You have to love me more is different than you have to hate everybody else. On the other hand, Matthew tends to ramp up the end of parables with lots of places of outer darkness where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth, which looks like a Matthean addition to some sort of original. So whenever we compare two texts and they seem to be saying different things, or they say what might be the same thing but in different wording, and one set of wording is easier to accept than the other, sure, that's going to cause problems. But just to say I like Matthew's version better than Luke, so I'm going to read with Matthew, doesn't resolve the problem. It just kind of tucks the problem away and says, I'm going to pretend it's not there. It's there, and therefore it should be dealt with.
And how does it change when one looks at the synoptic problem, looks at this in relationship to the synoptic problem? Because, I've asked you about this, and you said that you have the current view that Luke knows Matthew rather than the hypothetical Q document. So how would you say the views could be affected by suggesting that Matthew and Luke independently use Q, or that Luke knew Matthew instead?
In the long run, I don't think it's going to make any difference. If the point is somehow in using synoptic problem material, synoptic problem being how do the first three gospels relate to each other literarily, if the issue is let's try to get back to the historical Jesus, it's not going to matter. Because any text that we have has already been edited by or redacted by the gospel writers. They're giving us what they think Jesus might have said. Jesus may have also said the same thing, but in different ways, right? There's nothing stopping him from saying, if you love your parents more than me, you can't have every part of me, or you have to hate your parents in order to follow me. I can imagine him using both forms of that particular formulation. Nothing says that Jesus is walking around with 3x5 note cards with sayings written on them, and that's the only way he can express them. So my inclination is to think that whether Luke knew Matthew or there's a Q, which we don't have access to, and whether Luke is more original to Jesus than Matthew, or Matthew is more original, or whether neither of them is, and Jesus said some third thing, or whether we should just stick with Mark. The stuff is in the New Testament anyway. So even if Jesus didn't say it exactly as we've got it, which he probably didn't because he spoke Aramaic and we're reading Greek, I think we still need to deal with this because it's sitting there in the canon. Any person who wants to make the argument that New Testament scholars like me, or a bunch of other people with whom you've spoken, have like the true insight into Jesus, and we ought to get back behind the Gospels and get to Jesus, and that's really where the important stuff is. The problem is the scholars are all guessing. So I think I'm right. My colleagues who disagree with me think they're right. If one is trying to be a good Christian, which means to take seriously the New Testament text, then the Jesus we have is the Jesus the New Testament gives us, and not some sort of interior scholarly reconstruction. I would not give scholars that type of authority, including myself.
What do you make of that saying in the Gospels, pick up your cross and follow me?
Oh, I think he said that. That would make good sense to me, because Jesus tends to speak across the tradition. Whether we're just staying in the Synoptics, or even when we get to John, let alone the non-canonical stuff like the Gospel of Thomas, he tends to use very arresting phrases where you hear this and you go, "What?" But because he's got some sort of authority, which he probably has, because among other things, he's a miracle worker, certainly recognized as a miracle worker and an exorcist. So what exactly does that mean? It means you do whatever you have to do, even to the point of giving up your own life. And that's what we see through the scriptures of Israel. Hey, go walk through this. Go walk through the sea. You might, in fact, drown. But that's what you need to do. Leave your home. This is God talking to Abraham. Leave your home, leave your family, go to this place that I'll show you. And God doesn't even give him a map. Should have asked for a place with oil. And Abraham gets up and goes. So people are consistently putting their lives on the line in order to worship this God that Jesus would say you have to take up your cross. Makes perfect sense because it fits within his own tradition.
Does Jesus discuss hell?
Oh, I think so. Hell was having a pretty good run in the late Second Temple Jewish period. We don't have much of an idea of hell in the scriptures of Israel, that what the church calls the Old Testament or Jews call the Tanakh. They talk about this place called Sheol, which is kind of like this dark, pity place and down below somewhere. But usually when we get a reference to Sheol, particularly in the Psalms, it's like, and God rescued me from the pit of Sheol, as if there's like this continuum. It's like you're almost dead, you're sort of dead, you're mostly dead, you're dead. When we get into the Zoroastrian period, which is the Persian period following the return from Babylonian exile in 538, and that ends with the Hellenistic period starting in 333 with Alexander the Great, we start getting more of a sense of heaven and hell, or afterlife. And this would also make sense because the people had a sense that God was just. Well, if you're taken into exile and you survive this, and you've survived everything that could possibly be awful, where's the justice? Why aren't the bad people punished, and why aren't the good people rewarded? So certainly by the time we get into the Hellenistic period, given those various Greek myths about Sisyphus and Tantalus and all these folks being tortured in Hades, Jews are living in that environment, and they're beginning to think, well, okay, so what does happen to us after we die? So we begin to get some hints of heavenly redemption in the book of Daniel. And when we go to the non-canonical stuff, we begin to see a lot more attention to issues like hell, particularly in books like First Enoch.
What do you make of that saying? I think it's in Matthew's gospel where Jesus says, or it's claiming Jesus said, that if you do not feed the homeless man, the homeless person, you will out into the lake of fire for eternity you go.
Matthew has a lot of, you will be cast into the outer darkness where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth, which actually strikes me as sort of like being in a dentist office and the lights go out and the Novocaine has not quite set in yet. It's quite visceral. We get hints of hell, not only in some of the parables, like the parable of the fellow who after being forgiven an enormous debt refused to forgive a lesser debt. And he's actually threatened with being, in effect, drawn and quartered, cut into two. The parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, which is a heavenly view. And it looks like everybody here is a worshiper of Jesus, and Jesus is the king. And he consigns to this outer darkness the people who did not feed the hungry, clothe the naked, welcome the stranger, visit people in prison, and so on. And when the goats, who were the ones who were consigned to hell, say to Jesus, Jesus said, you did not take care of me when I was hungry. They say, well, when did we see you hungry? And Jesus responds, as you have done to the least, as you've done to me, it's to the least of these. In other words, you should be able to see the image of the Christ in anybody who is in need. And if you walk by that person who is in need, then you are damned. So the goats are screwed. And the sheep, who don't realize that the least of these happens to be Jesus, they are rewarded with heavenly bliss. It's pretty clear here that Jesus is basing consignment to heaven or hell, not based on confession of him, but based on action. What you do is what matters. This fits in with what we have in the Epistle of James, which I think has lots of actual Jesus material in it. It's got a lot of statements that look very much like the Sermon on the Mount. James says, faith without works is dead. It doesn't matter what you believe or what you confess. If you don't act on it, it doesn't count. And that's somewhat like the flip side of take up your cross and follow me. Unless you live this life of discipleship, which means in service to others, bye-bye.
What do you make of Jesus in the gospel saying, sell your clothes and buy swords? But he also says, supposedly, if you're stricken on the cheek, turn around, don't retaliate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it kind of looks like somebody in the Gospel of Luke, which is where we get this. If you don't have a sword, go out and buy one. He doesn't say sell your clothes, but what else are they going to sell? They got nothing else. Go out and buy one. The disciples we got a couple right here, which suggests that Luke kind of missed the Sermon on the Mount part. That's certainly possible. When Jesus talks about turning the other cheek, which is the way that typically is phrased, and here I'm in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, Luke has a version of this, but the Matthean version, which seems to me to be clearer, Jesus says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other. And then you got to figure out, why do we have the right cheek? Sort of like asking, why do we have he in the feeding of the 5,000? Why do they sit on green grass? And it's probably an allusion to Psalm 23, lying down in green pastures. Anyway, so why the right cheek? Because presuming a right-handed person, this is my right hand, to be struck on the right cheek is a backhanded slap. So you got to figure out where your right cheek is. If I strike you on the right cheek, I have to go like this. I can't give a decent right jab. So it's a slap not meant to harm, although it can. But it's really a slap of dismissal, like get out of here. The sort of slap that a master would give to an enslaved person or a Roman officer would give to a local on the road. And what Jesus says is, okay, you have a couple of options here. You can either give a decent right jab back, punch back, and intend to do harm, but that's just going to escalate the violence. And if somebody who has slapped you is your social superior, let alone a Roman officer, this is going to land you on a cross. So that doesn't do any good. It just escalates the violence. Where you could fall on the ground in a heap and say, okay, kick me, beat me, treat me like a doormat. I'm worth nothing, but that means you lose your dignity. You lose the sense that you too are in the image and likeness of God. So Jesus is here doing what I think the late and great biblical scholar Walter Wink, W-I-N-K, referred to as the third way. Find a way that doesn't escalate the violence, but also doesn't cause you to lose your human dignity. So Jesus says, turn the other cheek. I'm not going to respond to violence with more violence. And if you want to hit me with a decent right jab rather than a slap of dismissal. But I'm not going to respond with violence, and I'm not going to lose my dignity either. And it's this type of reaction that actually works in a number of cases. It's the same move that was used by freedom riders in the 1960s. I'm thinking about, I live in Nashville, so when people attempted to integrate lunch counters in Nashville, people who were not interested in integration would come up to these people who were sitting at the counter, and it was illegal for them to be there, and they would dump like ketchup on their heads. And then the protesters would hand them some mustard and say, here, put the mustard on too. It's passive. Well, it's not really passive, but it's a way of non-violent response. And sometimes it works. My guys at Riverbend Maximum Security Institute, where up until COVID I had been teaching, will sometimes use this in order to deflect violence in the prison system.
What do you make of John 8:44? You are of your father, the devil.
It's one of the most difficult verses that we have in the New Testament. And it unfortunately was quoted last year by the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference and then by Pope Francis. It didn't say you Jews are in their quotations, but anybody who knew the context knew that. And the Australian Bishops' Conference and then the Pope were using this to talk about recognizing evil when you see it. This caused quite a stir in Jewish-Christian relations. For the Gospel of John, and this is more of the difficult words of Jesus, the Jews, the Greek is Judaioi, plural, Judaios, singular, represent the world. And God so loved the world, but the world didn't love back. And because the world didn't love back, that part of the world that is not a follower of Jesus is consigned, in effect, to hell. They are children of Satan. And what makes it even more problematic is John has a strong predestinarian streak. The only people who can worship God. Oh, and by the way, the only way to worship God, according to the Gospel of John, is through Jesus. If you don't have Jesus, you don't have God. Are the ones whom Jesus calls to be with himself. So if you're not called, kind of like the sheep and the goats, bye-bye. John divides the world into, in effect, the followers of Jesus and everybody else become children of the devil. And the Jews, the word is used about 70 times in the manuscript tradition for the Gospel of John, generally represent what's bad. How do we deal with this? There are options, none of which is great. Some people want to translate Judaios as Judean rather than Jew, and that's a legitimate translation. But if we translate every single New Testament use of Judaios with Judean rather than Jew, then we can't talk about Jesus being a Jew or Paul being a Jew. Paul's not a Judean. He's from the Diaspora. He's from Tarsus. Jesus isn't from Judea. He's from Galilee. So we can't even talk about Jesus the Jew. That doesn't help. Moreover, I think people in churches are thinking Judean Jew. There's not much difference. It's sort of like saying resident of Vatican City. You're going to think Catholic, although not everyone is. we can say Jewish authorities or Jewish leaders or religious authorities or something like that. The problem is, I don't think that's how the Gospel of John was originally heard. Most people in antiquity are illiterate, so when John was being read, it was being read by somebody with the skill of literacy to a bunch of people who did not have a copy of John, like sitting on their laps. So it'd be like watching a movie or watching a play. Now, John uses this term about 70 times, and each time John uses it, Marcus is not going to look at Priscilla and say, do you think he's talking about all Jews here or just the Jewish leaders? That's not the way people hear things. They hear things like we hear something at a symphony, you hear a theme, it's going to be that same thing all the time, no matter what instrument is playing it or no matter what key it's being played in. So I don't think that's quite true, nor does talking about Jewish authorities or religious, which means Jewish authorities, help anyway, because the people in the pews are still going to think, oh, those are the Jews, and we're not them. To talk about, in some cases, political authorities might be helpful, given that the high priest is appointed by Pontius Pilate, and Pilate controls the high priestly garment, so the high priest can't do his job without Rome's consent. But I don't think John wants us to think that either. So how to deal with difficult stuff in any scripture. And as I've already mentioned, there's stuff in the Tanakh I'm not thrilled with either. Quite the contrary. I don't want to change the words of the text. I think that's unfaithful to the text. And I think it just means we're just not going to deal with it. I'd rather deal with it. So if this happens to be the reading for the week, then who's ever giving the sermon might want to put in a little comment about this. Or if you're in a church and somebody's reading this from the lectionary, you have a little order of worship. Because every time you walk into a church, somebody gives you a piece of paper with something on it, like, here are the phone numbers of the pastoral care team, and here's who's in the hospital, and here's what the Girl Scouts are doing, and here's what we're serving Wednesday night dinner, whatever. You put a little note in saying, this is a very problematic term. Our church says the following about the Jews. And then disavow anti-Semitism. I find that to be much more helpful because it acknowledges the problem. And it's usually the case that during a church service, even if it's just a flat hour or a flat 50 minutes, that everybody's going to get bored at one point during that service. They're going to look at the little paper and say, oh, this is interesting. Or you do adult education, or you start with children's education. You see, let's worry about this. Or if you're reading it, you can read it in an undertone. Which is what my rabbi has done sometimes in passages from the Torah. And I go to an Orthodox synagogue, so we're reading everything from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Deuteronomy. And when we get to some of that more problematic stuff, the rabbi or whoever happens to be chanting the Torah reading in Hebrew for that morning will change the chant just slightly or get softer to say, or you can hear it in his voice. I mean, he's wrestling with it. To say, here's a problem here and we need to address it. So there are various options. None of them resolves the problem. You can't resolve a problem of difficult texts, but you can address it. And that's, I think, what we need to do, to have the courage to address it.
So how would you methodologically deal with the difficult words of Jesus in general? Like trying to understand what Jesus really meant. Would it be for the Jewish context, but also trying to sort out at the same time what's most likely to be authentic and what's not?
Yeah, but these are not mutually exclusive approaches. I mean, you can look at what you think might go back to Jesus. You can look at what you think might have been the earliest and then the later redactional materials, regardless of whether it went back to Jesus or not. If one is doing this in the academy, I still think we have a responsibility to talk about things that will hit people problematically, of which anti-Semitism is certainly one, but also questions of economics and what is our economic responsibility? And if we have and somebody doesn't have, what do we do? When Jesus commends people for being like slaves, as many parables do, or when Jesus enacts himself as a slave, and we can see this in the Last Supper in John's version, where he strips off his garment, he wraps a towel around his waist, he washes the disciples' feet. I mean, this would be done by an enslaved person. And this is the model he's setting up for them. Well, how do we talk about that in the 21st century, knowing the legacy of slavery, knowing that human trafficking still exists, knowing that in some cases, in some places, we can't even talk about slavery anymore because it becomes a political hot potato. I think we need to address that. And we have various ways of doing so. We can do it in a sermon context. We can do it in a church context. So if somebody's reading a gospel passage, it might be nice to have the passage also in the order of worship or a pew Bible with notes. So people can look at it and go, because that's what we do with Torah readings. I mean, we have the text and we also have notes on the bottom. So people can figure out, what am I going to do with this? It can be addressed in a sermon. Ideally, if it's going to be read in a church, it should be addressed in a Bible study, because the very idea that somebody would walk into a worship service, hear a text read, and then not talk about it just seems bizarre to me. Because in the synagogue, we hear a text and then we talk about it a lot. In the classroom, I think we need to talk about this stuff, both in terms of its own historical context, what Jesus might have said. That's historical Jesus work. What the Gospels are trying to convey, and how these particularly difficult statements fit within their broader gospel narrative context, how they fit within what the Gospels themselves identify as the touchstones or the greatest commandments. And we can see that in Paul as well. Righteous living by faith, or love of God and love of neighbor. And how do these verses comply? We can compare them with other verses, as you already did with go by swords versus turn the other cheek. We can wrestle with these texts, and we may come up with our own ethical sense of, what are we going to do with this? We can also recognize that in any tradition, there's going to be baggage. Because no tradition is pristine. Everybody's got stuff in their backgrounds that they may be ashamed of, or that they may regret, or they may be horrified. But not to acknowledge them is to deny the human capacity for doing evil as well as for doing good. I'd rather have this stuff acknowledged and wrestled with, rather than hidden under the carpet. Because if you hide it under the carpet, somebody's going to trip over it at some point.
What do you make of Matthew 10:5-6 being anti-universalists, and contrasting to Paul in Galatians 3:28?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so in Matthew 10:5b-6, Jesus says something like, don't go to the Gentiles, don't go to the Samaritans, just go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. This is the beginning of the mission discourse. So Sermon on the Mount, first discourse, second discourse, chapter 10, mission discourse. And he's giving instructions to his disciples on, here's how you run a mission. They actually never go out on a mission. So unlike Luke, where, the 12 go out and they do stuff, and then Luke sends out 70 more and they go out and do stuff, Matthew never actually has a mission. He has a mission discourse with no mission. So we never actually see the disciples like on the road, then reporting back to Jesus. So that's a Matthew thing. I think that's temporary. I think Matthew is thinking like Paul here, when Paul says to the Jew first and also to the Greek, which is how it happened. I mean, Jesus was a Jew, born in a Jewish area, speaking primarily, if not entirely, to Jews. And then following proclamation of the resurrection, you start getting this Gentile mission. So part one in Matthew, which is the way it worked out historically, just go to the Jews. Samaritans are another problem. But Matthew, if you move to the end of Matthew, chapter 28, I think it's verse 19. It's the penultimate verse in the text. Matthew, the resurrected Jesus, says to the 11 disciples who were left up from this mountaintop in Galilee, go make disciples of Panta to Ethne, of all the Gentiles. In other words, part one of the mission is to the Jews, following the proclamation of the resurrection. Part two of the mission is to the Gentiles. And that's not inconsistent with Paul, who's also saying to the Jew first and also to the Greek. It's just that Paul is writing in a post-resurrection scenario. And he thinks, as a good Pharisee, which Paul was, that now that the Messianic age has begun, one of the signs of the Messianic age is that the Gentiles turn from worshiping their own gods to worshiping the God of Israel. And Paul's part of that process. So I don't see any contradiction here at all. I see a two-stage version in Matthew. Now, whether Jesus actually said Matthew chapter 10, verses 5b-6, because it's only in Matthew, I'm not convinced that he did. I think this is Matthew's after the fact explaining to Gentiles in these various Jesus-based assemblies, how come Jesus didn't come see you? And Matthew's way of doing it is to say, oh, because he just talked to the Jews. Why? Because they were the children of God and they had the Torah and they were the ones whom God chose. So of course they would get first dibs on this Messianic concern. But at the end, It's to everybody. A greater problem here in Matthew is whether the mission to the Jews is stopped or not. Matthew uses the word Judaios. This takes us back to conversation about John's gospel. Matthew uses the word Judaios quite hesitantly, usually on the lips of Gentiles, like the Magi, sometimes called wise men. I'm not sure how wise they are, who go up to King Herod the Great, the paranoid megalomaniac, and say, where's the one born king of the Jews? And Herod's kind of thinking, well, yeah, that's kind of my job description. So it's not a terribly politic question. Or Pontius Pilate, who says, are you the king of the Jews? Or puts on the cross the title Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So it's all on Gentile lips. But at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, right before the Great Commission, Matthew tells this completely nutty story about how the Pharisees suggest that they're going to bribe the guards so that if anybody asks about where the body is, the guards would say, oh, we fell asleep. And while we were asleep, the disciples came and stole the body. This is totally nuts. Why? Because first of all, no Roman guard is going to say, oh, my bad, I fell asleep on duty. That's a death sentence right there. And second of all, if they were asleep, they wouldn't know that the disciples came. So the whole story is to use the Yiddish term verkackt. It's ridiculous. And then Matthew says, and this story about the disciples having stole the body, and this story is told among the Jews, hoi Judaioi, until this day. And here that word hoi Judaioi is on the lips of the narrator, as if to say the Jews are the ones who believe this nutty story, and the mission, because the Great Commission is going to be the next scene, the mission is going to go now to Panta, to Ethne, to all the Gentiles. On the other hand, Matthew never ends the mission to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It's ongoing, but I get the feeling that for Matthew, the future of the church is with the Gentiles. It's the disciples in Galilee facing outward rather than disciples in Galilee going back to Judea. Probably more than you wanted to know, by the way.
Oh, it's fine. What did Jesus mean by saying lifted up?
Lifted up? You mean lift up, his being lifted up?
Yeah.
Okay, because I don't think Jesus walks around going, lifted up, but in the Gospel of John, he talks about himself being lifted up a number of times. And this is Johannine punning. For all that John 8:44 and many other verses in the Gospel of John are highly problematic, John is a fabulous writer, and he will pun. And what John wants us to do in reading this text is go from our mundane linguistic ordinary quotidian way of living, way of speaking, and move us linguistically into something that's more magical and shimmery and shiny. And we can see this over and over again. When John talks to Nicodemus, this Pharisee, in chapter 3, Jesus says, when Jesus talks to Nicodemus, Jesus says, you have to be born. The Greek is anothen, which can mean from above or anew or again. And Nicodemus takes it as again and says, how am I supposed to crawl back into my mother's womb? I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's the literal meaning. And what John wants is something more transcendent. You have to be born from above. You have to be born anew. Come out of your normal identity, which is your birth-given identity, and somehow be reborn into this new movement. When Jesus speaks with the Samaritan woman at the well, in the next chapter, they talk about living water. But it's in both Greek and Hebrew, it's the same expression for living water and running water. So the woman thinks it's running water. Jesus is talking about living water. It's the same expression. Move on. So when Jesus talks about being lifted up, and now I'm back here in chapter 3 at the end talking to Nicodemus, he talks about just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man will be lifted up. So this is one of these really marvelously bizarre stories of apotropaic magic. Apotropaic is using a symbol of evil to ward off evil. It's like a gargoyle on a cathedral. Like it keeps the demons away because the demons look at the gargoyle and go, oh, scared, run. I'm sure that works. So there's a plague of poisonous snakes biting people. And the idea is you lift up this bronze serpent called Nehushtan, and people look at this bronze serpent, the symbol of evil, and suddenly they are cured of their snake bite. So Jesus talks about, well, when I'm lifted up onto this pole, which then we know is the cross, and people look at me and they realize what I am and who I am, then they will have eternal life. So Jesus is lifted up as the snake was lifted up. He's lifted up on the cross, but more, because John overloads here, he's also lifted up into heaven, because in the Gospel of John, Jesus is like this guy who comes down from heaven, lives on earth for a while. Like in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So that's up in heaven. Then the Word takes on flesh. That's John 1:44. And then at the end, Jesus goes up. So he's back up in heaven so that the Holy Spirit of the Paraclete can come back down. So he's lifted up like the snake in the wilderness. He's lifted up on the cross, which is an instrument of death. But in the Gospel of John, it's also an instrument of new life. And he's lifted up into heaven. This is John. Change the way you use words, and you change the way you think about the world. It's extraordinary.
What about that saying, the first will be last and the last will be first?
It sounds like somebody, like one of those hamsters on those wheels, because once you're first, then you have to go to the end of the line again. It shows up in a number of times in the Gospels as if it's some sort of pat saying that the Gospel writers thought, oh, I think I'll stick it in here, and I think I'll stick it in here because it nicely ends things. Did Jesus say something like that? It wouldn't surprise me because it sounds like that heightened rhetoric, that arresting rhetorical form that Jesus is likely to use. I'm not happy with this, by the way. So Jesus and I, we argue on occasion. We have discussions. If the last are first and the first are last, then we still have a system of enormous inequality. And I don't find that to be a good thing. I'd rather have people being more equal or egalitarian so that nobody's first and nobody's last, but everybody's in the middle. And if it's a case where somebody's always first and somebody's always last, yes, shift it around, but I won't want to keep it like that for all eternity, because that puts people in systems of privilege. And it's not necessarily the case that people who have been socially marginalized, so the last, are necessarily more righteous than people who have not been socially marginalized. So I think it's a statement that requires some wrestling. On the other hand, for people who do feel themselves to be socially marginalized or tortured to death, people who take up their crosses willingly and do what needs to be done and suffer horrendous consequences because they do that, I think every once in a while they ought to receive some sort of special praise. They ought to be brought up first for a little bit. So I wrestle with this, and whether I'm talking in general terms, I don't like it. When I'm talking about it in specific terms, I can see where on certain occasions it might actually be helpful. This is what I mean by, Jesus makes us wrestle with this stuff. These are good ethical questions.
I Fish and a Tie, thank you for your super sticker. Solar Night, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Amy, 12 tribes of Israel fleeing, then migrated into Europe, forming nations, later including America. Explain the 144,000 tribes evading Roman invasion, 6670 AD, Revelation 7:3 and 14:4. Don't think, that doesn't have anything to do with this topic.
Not really. I mean, I can hit it pretty quickly. By the time we get down to the 1st century, most tribal identification is gone. The 10 northern tribes are conquered by the Assyrian Empire in 722 and dispersed. It's not clear where they were dispersed, but Afghanistan is actually a pretty good bet given the geography at the time, and certain indigenous Afghani traditions, which look a little bit like ancient Israelite traditions. The idea that they eventually made it to America is highly problematic. We don't have any good evidence of this. Inscriptions that people thought were Hebrew turn out not to be. So then we're in the realm of imagination. Some people argued that the tribe of Dan eventually gave us the people in Denmark. I don't think so. We do have some evidence of tribes in the time of Jesus. The prophetess Anna is identified, for example, as of the tribe of Asher. That's one of the northern tribes. Paula's tribe of Benjamin, that's from the south. We've got the tribe of Judah, which is the family of Joseph, the husband of Mary, which then becomes the family of Jesus. So we do have the southern tribes that are left. The book of Revelation gives us 12 tribes, 144,000, 12,000 from each tribe, who follow the Lamb wherever he goes, and they're sealed with the seal. But first of all, the tribe of Dan goes missing from that group. So now we got to figure out, well, how are we going to name the tribes? Because the namings differ. I mean, do we count Joseph? Do we drop Joseph and count Ephraim, Manasseh, and so on? And it's not clear from the book of Revelation whether those those 144,000 represent Jews at the time of Jesus or subsequent to the time of Jesus, or whether they represent like Old Testament saints. They're certainly not going to reproduce anymore. That's it. They're only men and they're only virgins. So this strikes me as some sort of highly idealized image of a pure sense of ancient Israel in John's imagination, rather than something that we can trace out historically.
Fish and Ty, thank you for your super chat. Did Jesus saying "love your enemy" change the world?
Nope. Because if it did, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in. And on occasion, comments like "love your enemy," much like "do unto others as you would have them do unto you," it's both from the Sermon on the Mount, wind up negatively impacting other people. So the best example of where this went wrong in the same case is Christian missionaries dealing with indigenous populations. So if you think the indigenous population in Canada and the United States and Australia, for example, is your enemy, then what do you want to do? You want to conquer them by converting them to Christianity. Or if you want them, if the idea is if you want somebody to love you as you love them, well, if you think that everybody ought to be a Christian because you would want to be a Christian, then you would want to convert them as well. So these various comments, which clearly didn't work because the world is still a mess, and Christian views loving enemies like the Crusades, the Inquisition, I'll love them to death. I don't quite need that. Wound up being quite dismissive, if not attempting to obliterate traditions that didn't match up with theirs. I think it's a good idea. I prefer personally, on the practical level, what the scriptures of Israel give us. So Jews are not commanded to love our enemies. We're commanded to do things that come close. I don't think people can love on automatic. You can't. I used to write love letters to famous musicians when I was a kid. It's like I couldn't convince them to love me, because you can't convince somebody to love you. You can't make an argument for it. But you can willingly be kind and nice to people. So the scriptures of Israel tell us that if your enemy is hungry, you have to give him something to eat. And if your enemy is thirsty, you have to provide water. And if your enemy loses a donkey, you have to tell him where the donkey is, and you can't mislead him. And I'm okay with that. If we could simply be civil to our enemies, that's a whole lot easier than the idea of loving, and it's a whole lot more practical.
Solara Knight, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Amy, Matthew 10 calling to gather up 144,000. Truly I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes, Messiah with escape route into wilderness.
I don't think Matthew 10 is about calling 144,000. So that requires reading Matthew in light of Revelation. But in Revelation, the 144 are people who are already following the Lamb wherever he goes. So they don't, it sounds like Mary with her sheep. So they don't need the disciples to go out and get them. And as I noted, there is no mission in the Gospel of Matthew. So the disciples don't go out and get 144. They don't go out and get anybody. And when they're finally sent on a mission, it's go make disciples of Panta to Ethne, of all the Gentiles. So the only mission that Matthew actually gives the disciples is to the Gentiles, not to the Jews. Is it an escape route? It's Matthew 10. I think it's verse 23 in chapter 10. I may be wrong, but I think it's 23. That says, you will not finish going through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Highly problematic statement. Does it mean comes in the sense of returns regarding the resurrection? Or does it mean the sense of coming on clouds of glory to gather his elect from the ends of the earth? Matthew has to delay eschatology a little bit because Matthew knows the end didn't come. The temple is destroyed. The end hasn't come. Matthew has a copy of Mark. I'm pretty sure about that regarding the Synoptic Problem. And Matthew pushes back that kind of eschatological time clock. As New Testament scholars are wont to say, for Mark, it's like 5 minutes to midnight. For Matthew, it's like 8 o'clock in the evening. You can get in a load of laundry. For Luke, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You can go shopping. So Matthew doesn't expect these disciples to do this in the first place.
Jeff Sturrett, thank you for your super chat. Matthew 15, Canaanite woman. Why do you think offer included acceptable at the time, but not now? Don't hear too many sermons on this.
I like the chapter. Matthew and the Canaanite women in Matthew 15. It's a rewrite, again, presuming Matthew had access to Mark, of Mark chapter 7, which is a story about a woman who was identified as Greek Syrophoenician by birth. But it's the same story. It's about a Gentile woman who's got a demon-possessed daughter, and Jesus doesn't want to do the healing. This is one of the few examples, by the way, where Matthew lengthens the story in Mark rather than condenses it. It does show up in lectionary. So if you're in a lectionary-based church, you will get this story, particularly the Markan version, less so the Matthean version, in part probably because Mark's is shorter. Why is it there? Well, it's not there in Luke. It's part of what's called the Great Omission. It's certainly not there in John. I think Luke might have had a problem with it. So now we have to guess why isn't something there. I think Luke might have had a problem with it because Luke doesn't like women telling Jesus what to do. I mean, Luke likes women as long as they're kind of silent and servile and seated at Jesus' feet. He doesn't like mouthy women outside of the infancy stories. I think it shows the wrestling that the early church had with the question of what are we going to do with the Gentile mission? And should the benefits of the church, this is very, very early on, go to the Gentiles? And the answer is yes, as long as the Gentiles acknowledge that Jesus is Lord and therefore his Father is Lord and not the particular gods that they would be worshiping. The reason I like Matthew's version better, not only because it's longer, is because it's more edgy. In the Gospel of Mark, we have a temporal concern. The woman says to Jesus, my daughter's, suffering from demon possession. And Jesus says, let the children first be fed because it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now that first makes all the difference in the world. So the idea is the Jews get the mission first, and then afterwards, it's going to go to the Gentiles. Dogs does not mean Gentiles. Dogs is just an all-purpose insult. And the woman, through a very clever word, says, look, even the dogs under the table eat the crumbs. Right. Jesus said, yeah, for your word. In other words, because of what you said, let it be done for you. And the woman goes home and finds her daughter healthy. Good. In Matthew, they're not in a house. Jesus is not trying to be hid. They're kind of out on the border. And it's not even clear whether Jesus got into Tyre and Sidon. He's heading in that direction. She rushes out to meet him. So they're somewhere outside. And she says, my daughter is severely possessed by a demon. And he doesn't answer her at all. And the disciples, who don't show up in Mark's version, say, loose her. That's the Greek. Now, whether this means loose her from the demon, perform the exorcism, or whether this means send her away, I think the disciples are actually asking on her behalf, loose her. If you're Roman Catholic, generally the view is it's intercessory prayer on the part of the disciples, perform the exorcism. And if you're Protestant, where they don't have intercessory prayer through disciples or saints, it means get rid of her. But I'm Jewish. I don't have a horse in that race. And then Jesus says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, which repeats that business back in chapter 10, verse 6. Just go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And she says, look, Lord, help me. And he says it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. There's nothing about first and last. It's a nothing. Then she kneels in front of him, prostrates herself as Lord help me. Even the children eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. She's acknowledging he's got everything. She's got nothing. But what she's actually doing is that model of turning the other cheek. She's engaging exactly in that third way. He calls her a dog. She could have said, well, F you. And that just ratchets up the rhetoric. That doesn't get you anywhere. Or she calls her a dog and she says, fine, I'm a dog. And she puts her tail between her legs and she slinks off. And that's not going to get the exorcism either. So rather than heightening the rhetoric and rather than giving up her dignity, she says, you want to call me a bitch? Fine. I'm a bitch, but I'm entitled to, because even dogs are entitled. And she's like, good for you, lady. Matthew says it's because of her faith. So that's a Matthew concern, because Matthew's really interested in people displaying faith. She gets what she wants. That's enacting the Sermon on the Mount. And there's so much cool about this. One more cool thing about this is Matthew begins with a genealogy. And in Matthew's genealogy, there are at least 2 Canaanite women. One's certain. This would be Rahab, the prostitute from Jericho. Second woman mentioned in the New Testament. And she gets what she wants, even though the spies are going into the brothel. When the spies go into the brothel, they're not going there to check out the munitions dump. They're going to the brothel for other reasons. And Tamar, the first woman mentioned in the New Testament, who may well have been a Canaanite. And the man with whom she's paired, Judah, just has sex with her and then wants to burn her alive when she turns up pregnant. So what do I have? Matthew's genealogy gives me at least 2 Canaanite women who operate correctly and through cleverness when the Jewish men with whom they are paired do not. So as soon as Matthew tells me in chapter 50, and I've got a Canaanite woman, I know that she, through cleverness, is going to get what she wants, and the Jewish man with whom she is paired is initially going to come off as resistant, but will eventually get with the program. It's brilliant.
Now, the next super chat is super off topic. But anyway, so Laura and I, thank you for your super chat. How did so many Jews end up in Germany?
Well, the diaspora, I was talking about the diaspora Jews living outside the land of Israel, begins certainly by the time of the Babylonian exile. There were already Jews living in Egypt at the time. More go down to Egypt to escape Babylonian attack, including the prophet Jeremiah, who's brought down to Egypt. There are Jews living in the broader Persian Empire when Persia conquers Babylon. And we can see this, for example, in the book of Esther and parts of the book of Daniel. Esther is set in the Persian Empire. And people started to move through Hellenistic times. People are more toward Alexandria and Egypt. They're also moving points west. And after Roman, and this would be formally in the year 6 before the Common Era, they're moving toward Rome, which means they're moving out into Italy and through there into France and into Germany. And go to Germany today or Croatia, parts of Italy outside the city of Rome, England, and you can see Roman ruins. Well, where Roman troops go, other people in the empire follow. And Jews had no reason not to follow. As Christianity began to develop, both in the east, coming from the center in Constantinople, coming from the west, the center in Rome, the farther away one got from the center of the Christian empire, sometimes the easier it was for them to live, for example, in pagan lands. And Jews continued to migrate, as did other people. The thing is that lots of people migrated, but we don't have traces of them. Why? Because they did not retain their own ethnic identities. So Italians who moved to Germany eventually Germanic became Germans, in effect. But the Jews, because they had these particular customs, because they were very often endogamous, just marrying within the Jewish community, were able to keep their own identity. And as the empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and now we're speaking about, Charlemagne, we're moving off toward Germany, insisted that everybody be Catholic. The Jews are still holding on to their own identity. So not only to Germany, but to Poland, to Czechoslovakia, to the various states that used to comprise the Soviet Union, think of Belarus and Ukraine and Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and places like that, where they were initially welcomed, as they were kicked out of places in Europe. They kicked out of England, kicked out of Spain, kicked out of Portugal. A number went to the Netherlands, and then points farther east from there. So part of this greater diaspora is an affect of Christian pressure. Part of it is, as the United States is, like, why did so many people from Ireland or from Italy or from Poland or from Nigeria land here? Well, some of it is economic opportunity. Some of it is freedom of religion. Some of it is the slave trade. So people move. And then the question is, do they hang on to their indigenous identity, their original identity, or do they simply acculturate and then fully assimilate? So they simply become part of this, what used to be called the melting pot, rather than the salad bowl.
Magi Mike, thank you for your super chat. Following Jesus' death, disciples are preaching by the Spirit, eventually separating fully from the Jewish religion. Do you believe modern Christianity would be different if it sustained Hebrew and understanding context?
Yeah, it certainly would have been different. How different it would have been requires me to engage in fictional speculation rather than history. So I'm an historian. I can't tell you what could have happened otherwise. If it had just stayed within Jews, then we wouldn't have a universal religion. We probably wouldn't have the New Testament as we've got it. I probably would have been a lawyer like my mother wanted me to be. How would it have been different? Well, we don't have any words of Jesus preserved in Hebrew or Aramaic, so we would have had a different Jesus to rely on, as opposed to a Greek New Testament, later translated into Latin, at least for the West, and the Peshitta and Syriac, and then Armenian and Georgian for places points east. Followers of Jesus would have been following Torah, which they are not. Jews at the time, as far as we can tell, never expected Gentiles to convert to Judaism. When Zechariah talks about 10 Gentiles grabbing hold of the Jew and saying, "Take me with you to Zion, because we know God is with you," they don't say, like, "Oh, and circumcise us when we get there." In other words, they come in as Gentiles who are now worshiping the God of Israel. My friend Paula Fredrickson calls them ex-pagan pagans, which I think is a great title. Would it have worked? I don't know. I kind of doubt it. Would it have been different? Absolutely, but I can't go there.
Solera Knight, thank you for your super chat. Visions of Paul, fake news superimposed later?
Oh, I don't think so. If we're talking about Paul's own claim to vision, so look at something like 2 Corinthians, where Paul says he doesn't boast. Yeah, right. I know a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I'm not sure, who was caught up to the third heaven and saw stuff that it can't be reported. Well, Paul's talking about himself. And he's probably being modest, because there are at least 7 heavens, if not 9. So he like made it up to the 3rd floor. But he may be being modest by saying, "I only made it to the 3rd floor, but hey, you guys in Corinth, like, you didn't even get to floor 1. I think Paul had visions. People have visions. Lots of people have visions. People today have visions. Sometimes we call them dreams or hallucinations. Do we act on them all the time? No. Sometimes we do. Does this make him insane? I don't think so. And then we have to worry about what constitutes even sanity or people having visions. I mean, people imagine what they saw their dead spouse. Or they looked up in the clouds and they saw something, they saw a cross. Or here in Nashville, they looked at a cinnamon bun and it looked like Mother Teresa. And somehow people decided to give to charity after that. It's called the nun bun. I don't know if it's still preserved or not. People have visions all the time. Do we act on them? I don't know. But is it fake news? I don't think so. I think Paul had a vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus, because otherwise I can't figure out why he changed. Now, could you catch it on a camera? That's a different question.
What do you make of the saying in the Gospels about Jesus telling them that some of you will not taste death before
they see the kingdom of God come in power? Yeah. And you get that in Mark 9, you get it in relation to the transfiguration, which is already kind of seeing the kingdom come in power. Like, whoa, looks like Jesus, and it looks like, oh, maybe he's back in what Adam originally looked like before we got like the human form that we've got now, like these magical glowy skin. Maybe he looks like a super angel. Maybe they see the kingdom coming in power when somebody is healed or exercised or fed when they're hungry. Or clothed when they're naked. I mean, so how do you determine what it means when they see the kingdom come in power? For that one person who's hungry, who gets a piece of bread, that's the kingdom coming in power.
Did Jesus believe himself to be the Son of Man when he was talking about that he will come back in their lifetime, or the Son of Man will come down in their lifetime? Does that mean that the second coming was supposed to happen in their lifetime?
Oh, well, yeah, I think so. So back when I was in graduate school, which was back pretty much when Noah was still on the ark, there was this idea that Jesus referred to himself as Son of Man. That strikes me as likely, because the expression sounds kind of awkward. We use to anthropo in Greek. It sounds kind of weird. But barinash in Aramaic sounds okay. So that's an okay expression, which could mean, an individual or a person. In the old King James version for the Psalm, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou carest for him? That sort of thing. It means a person. It plays on the book of Daniel that talks about one like a son of man. So an angelic being, perhaps Michael, who looks like a human being. You get a sense of this in Judges 13. The story of the conception and birth of Samson, where the Mrs. Manoah, we don't have a name for her, she's out in the field and she sees this being, wonderful, glorious to look at, a man of God, right? So it's an angelic being who looks sort of semi-human. Jesus uses this as a self-designation. Foxes have holes and birds have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. That's in Matthew and Luke. And then you get the Son of Man will come with the angels on clouds of heaven. That's an image from Daniel. So back when I was in graduate school, the idea was that Jesus just talked about himself as the Son of Man, like this human being. And then later, his followers said, oh, he's this apocalyptic, eschatological, Danielic Son of Man. I think he used it across the board. And it would not surprise me that he thought of himself as the Son of Man, as some sort of agent of God, whose job it was to prepare people for the inbreaking of the kingdom of God, this eschatological age. We have similar use of the term Son of Man in the similitudes of Enoch, which were probably around at the time. Unfortunately, chapters 37 to 71 of First Enoch were not found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, but this stuff looks like it's pretty early, even though the texts we have are later than the first century. So I think Jesus thought of himself as this divine representative, and it would not surprise me that he talked about somehow being this supernatural figure who would gather his elect. Before or after he died, that's another question.
Fish Natai, thank you for your super chat. What Jesus' teaching was most offensive to his peers?
Don't know, because I don't have his peers to ask him. I can imagine a number of them were, and some of them probably weren't so much. I think sell all you have and give to the poor. Again, it's a one-off, but that's pretty much what he asked his disciples to do. Like, leave your home and your family and come follow me. I think they found that highly problematic. I think they would have worried about who are my mother and my brothers and sisters, those who hear the word of God and do it. Particularly since when he says that, and here in Mark's earlier version, his mother Mary and his brothers and sisters, or if you prefer cousins or half siblings, are outside. And I think Luke was so disturbed about that he wants to make sure that, oh no, the NATO family got with the program, just because it's too edgy. I think they were worried about hating your parents and all that similarly, which is why Matthew massages it. So when I have an originally edgy saying, and then I've got a massage of that, at least I get a sense there that at least some gospel writers found this not to be easy, or thought maybe we ought to leave this one out, or maybe you ought to fiddle with it a little bit. But it's really hard to say. In the same way, it's really hard to say what's the most offensive thing that Jesus said, to Christians today. It's going to depend upon the Christian that one asks.
Jeff Sturrett, thank you for your super chat. Are parables unique in Gospels and Greco-Roman world?
No, they're not unique at all. Aesop's fables are like parables, and fables, by the way, there's been some really, really good work recently on Roman fables. Fables look very, very much like parables. We have parables in rabbinic tradition. We have parables in the scriptures of Israel, like Nathan's parable of the ewe lamb, where's that 2 Samuel 12, the parable of the trees in Judges chapter 9, parts of the book of Proverbs function like parables, metaphors that relate to something in the real world, and you have to figure out what the ethical message is. So no, they're not unique to Jesus. They're a form that's recognizable, and their form is also usually quite edgy. So they're not sweet little children's stories, which is how we deal with them today, in part maybe because of Aesop's fables, and in part because little kids can understand parables. Like the Good Samaritan means, you're nice to somebody who's injured by the side of the road. But they're really moral challenges, and they're frequently things that tell us what we already know, but we don't want to acknowledge it. To go back to Aesop, like in The Tortoise and the Hare, we all know that slow and steady wins the race, but nobody wants to be the tortoise. Everybody wants to rush through things and get stuff done so you can go out and play. Parables tell us what we already know, but we don't want to listen. And what makes Jesus' parables so good is that not only is he telling us what we don't want to know, which is tough to swallow, but he does it in such a humorous manner that we're kind of laughing even while our hearts are sinking and going, oh, damn, yeah, he's probably right. This is kind of funny. He's right, and I'm indicted. But I wrote a whole book about that, so we don't have to do that anymore.
Gary S., thank you for your super chat. Thoughts on Nina Livesey's work on Paul Isinga?
Can't comment, don't know it well enough.
So for my last question, what would you say to someone that's trying to wrestle in general the difficult words of Jesus? And I know you'll probably say that it really depends on the context of how one looks at it, and there are different ways of interpreting it. Somebody in the modern world could interpret Jesus' sayings differently than how people interpreted it back then. So what would you say to that?
Texts always take on meaning in terms of the context. So we don't come to the text as a blank slate, right? So when we hear a text, it might be perfectly okay for one person and quite horrific for somebody else. So how do we interpret it? Well, one general rule that works most of the time, there's nothing that's foolproof here, and there's nothing that's 100% effective. One general rule when looking at the Bible, looking at any sort of literature or art, is to say, what does this text mean to me? What does it remind me of? Do I find it problematic? Do I find it comforting? Do I find it challenging? Do I find it ridiculous? Do I find it just kind of a metaphor? What does it mean to me? And then you've already got something. And the next step is to figure out what it's meant to other people who have thought about it, perhaps thought about it longer, or who can read the Greek, or if we're looking at the scriptures of Israel, who can read the Hebrew and the Aramaic, to learn something about the historical context, to try to imagine, and it has to be an active historical imagination, what might this text have meant to the people who first heard it, or what might the person who wrote it have intended, as best as we can get to authorial intent. And that means if I've got something in Matthew, then I need to know the rest of Matthew to see how this particular verse fits. You may well change your mind as you go through this. So you come up with, here's what it means to me, and then you massage it a little bit because you read some commentary. And then you read Matthew, and then you say, oh, but it could also mean this, it could also mean that. Or you think, I might want to know what Martin Luther thought it meant, or John Wesley, or John Calvin, or Thomas Aquinas, or the early church fathers, or, somebody who's writing the newspaper column, God help you. And you find more and more, and then you have to come to your own conclusion. So at the end of the process, again, you're saying, what does this text mean to me? But now your answer is a much more informed answer. And it doesn't say you have to like it.
So Laura Knight, thank you for your super chat. Son of God, Romans worship Son, especially December 25th, Sol Invictus cult.
Yeah, but now we're after Constantine, so we're way up there. I mean, listen, you got a holiday, you don't want to get rid of it. Nobody wants to get rid of a good holiday. So you kind of baptize it into your newer traditions, and you keep the customs that you like. For the holiday of Purim, which is connected to the book of Esther, which Jews celebrate, usually comes around end of February, beginning of March. We read the entire book of Esther, and we eat these little triangular shaped cakes called Hamantash and Haman's pockets, or Tashin's a pocket, so Haman's pockets, or Haman's hat, like a tri-corner hat. And they're filled with things like prune and poppy seed and apricot. There's probably originally a cake to the mother goddess, so go like this and just imagine a little farther down. They're probably cakes to the mother goddess, but you got a good piece of pastry, you want to hang on to it. Candy canes and Yule logs have nothing to do with the Christmas story. Easter eggs don't have anything to do with Easter, nor does the name Easter. It comes from a British goddess. But you got the eggs, you got the bunny, you got fertility. You keep all that stuff. So you've got this nice holiday to Sol Invictus, the sun god, which is December 25th. So it's like the dark, and the sun overcomes the darkness. Keep the date. You've already got a holiday in place. And if you got a couple of other, pieces of pastry or candy to go with it, why not? Why not? And then you can backtrack and say, oh, well, Jesus must have been raised. We know sometime during the holiday of Passover. So we'll make that, say, March 25th, day of the crucifixion. And then therefore, given perfection, count back 9 months, then he must have been conceived on December 20. He must have been born that same date. And then you work up 9 months and you get to December, and people started doing math and all that. Why not? Why not? If the Gospel of Luke gives us anything that's historical, Jesus was not born in the middle of winter, because shepherds would not be out in the fields by night with their flock.
I actually do have one more question, because I forgot to ask this earlier. What was being referred to in Mark when there was demons being called legion?
Oh, that's great. So in Mark 5, that's a great passage. Long one too, 20 verses. So back then, this actually works today. If you want to have power over somebody, you know that person's name. So like if I'm in a classroom and I have, 100 students out there, I got nothing. But if I know that the person sitting in the third row on the left who's doing Facebook, if I know her name, I can say, hey, Janie. I now have power over her, right? So one way you get power over demons is you find out what their names are. Sometimes the names are hidden. So when Jesus, and they know Jesus, Holy One of God, Jesus of Nazareth, like they're trying to get power over him. So when the demon responds, my name is Legion, for we are many, technically this means the man is possessed by more than one demon. He's possessed by a legion of demons. I'm talking about 600 people here, maybe more. But it's also a pun. Because Roman troops went by legions. So what is this image? It's what do you do with a Roman legion? A Roman legion is like somebody that occupies your land, like this demon has occupied this guy's body, and it drives you insane, and it throws you into the tombs, and it hurts you because this guy's cutting himself on the rocks. Whether this is deliberate harm or just scraping himself as he's going up on the rocks is not clear. And then what do you want to see happen to the Roman legion? Let him enter a group of pigs and then stampede into the ocean and drown. So it's really quite a political statement here. The pigs are also, to call somebody a pig in the Roman Empire, this is pointed out by biblical scholar Warren Carter, is actually a very nasty sexual joke as well. So it's a feminization and a pigification, porcination, I'm not sure what the word would be, of the Roman legion, and then you kill them. Did this really happen? Gee, I don't know. Matthew sets the scene in a place called Gerasa, which is not near the seacoast at all, which is why Matthew moves it, which is helpful. I'm going to put it in Gadara, a different location. But Gerasa comes from the Hebrew word gerash, which means to expel. It's the Hebrew word used for when God kicks Adam and Eve out of Eden, they are gerashed. So the place is named Expulsionville or Exorcismville. So it looks like a very nice satirical story about what you would want to see happen to the Roman legions. What a great story.
I'd like to remind everybody real quick before we close that the link to purchase the difficult words of Jesus will be in the description below in the pinned comment. And that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, AJ.
Always a pleasure. I never quite know what we're going to be talking about, but it's always fun. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me once again.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.